Today I'm going to show you guys how to make pouches for a utility belt. You're going to need a pen or something else to write with, something to cut with, either an X-Acto knife or a pair of scissors, velcro, a hot glue gun, some Cellulose foam or some other type of EVA foam. I'm using 3mm today, black paint, and some paint brushes. And as far as a sealer, if you'd like to use that, I have Mod Podge or a spray, just kind of how you want it to look at the end. You can choose one or the other, not even to use it. A ruler, a discarded cigarette pack, and this is also optional. It is DAP, Alex Fast Dry. It's an acrylic latex caulk meant for plumbing. It also has silicone in it, and it works really good to smooth out seams and things like that. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing I do is I'm going to line up my cigarette pack, and I'm going to leave a little bit of space on the side of it, and I'm going to lay down a ruler and trace a line. Once again, giving myself a little bit of space here on the side. And the reason why I'm giving this space is because I want the side pieces, once I wrap the outside and glue this foam onto it, to fit inside and be as flush as possible. There will be a seam around it, but I'm going to use some of the plumber's caulk to smooth that out later. Once I get this lined up, I'm going to draw a line along the inside here on the ruler and then cut this piece off. Now that I have my EVA foam piece cut, I'm going to place the pack on it, and starting with the very top here where the flap is, I'm going to line it up, and I'm going to go around it and figure out where the corners are. I'm going to crease them. Now you don't need to crease them, you can just start gluing it to it, wrapping it around. However, if you want a squared edge, you want to crease it. And I would like the squared edge to be slightly round, so I'm just going to crease this here, here, and at the other 2 points of articulation on the top by hand. This can be assisted with a heat gun or a slight cut on the inside to get somewhat of a more square edge. But I want the edge to be slightly rounded, so I'm just going to crease this by hand. I start by applying some hot glue and folding it over. Once I attach to here, I'm going to continue to glue all the other pieces around it. Okay, now I have it glued all the way around, but you have all this excess here. Now, how you want to trim this excess off is pretty much up to you, depending upon what you're making it for and how you would like it to look. Okay, so this one I just cut straight. And next we will move on to the sides. So this next part is about the least sophisticated, not that any of this is hyper sophisticated, but the least sophisticated part of this. The EVA foam itself is very impressionable. So to get the side pieces, what I do is I close this fully, and I hold this down tight. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this into my excess piece of EVA foam. And it will leave an impression, which I will then trace with the pen and cut out. Okay, so I got out my piece and I traced it a little bit larger than the impression. And I did that because you can always trim some off, but you can't put any back on. Then I close this up, I sit my piece on top, and it's a little bit big for the bottom, but up top here it fits in pretty well. So what I did was I marked here where I want it to end, and looked there and marked it, and just embedded a little line with my fingernail, which I will then cut. And I will trim a little bit of excess off the bottom, because this top piece here sticks out a little bit more because it's going to overlap. So I traced a copy of the first side I did the impression of, and hot glue can be a little messy, it can ooze out. When it does, I usually use a scrap piece of EVA foam to clear it off. Contact cement is a little bit longer just as far as waiting for it to sit, but it does do a much cleaner job and sticks very well. And if you don't want these to open, you can always just seal them, just to be for show. And all this stuff here on the sides, the seam and the little gaps and everything, I'm going to fill with the plumber's caulk that I showed you at the beginning of the video. Okay, so for this next part, you want to go in a well-ventilated area like outdoors, or I am in my garage with the door open. And I'm going to be applying the DAP Fast Dry Acrylic Latex Caulk Plus Silicone to these edges here to cover up the seams. Now I have this in a caulking gun, and I'm going to put a pretty generous amount on it. And then I'm going to smooth all this out with my finger. Now I spread it out, and as you'll see, it's pretty rough. It doesn't look very good. So what you're going to need to do is get a container with a little bit of water, dip your finger in it, and smooth it out. Now this is kind of tricky, and I saw this initially in a YouTube video. Raw Customs, I believe. And it took me a while to figure out just how damp to get my finger, how wet to get this. This is acrylic, so you can apply water to it. And it kind of takes a knack to it. So you may want to test this on something else first before you do it on a finished project. I'm going to smooth this out and let you see how it looks. And after a few applications, you can see the surface is relatively smooth. And you'll notice that I'm doing these pieces separate. And I generally recommend letting at least several hours before this is set up enough and firm enough that you can flip this over and do the other side. And if you also wish to get out any other little imperfections, once it's sat for at least 24 hours or so, you can go back with a very fine grit sandpaper, which I will most likely do, and smooth it off before your final painting. Here again, you can see how rough it is. I'm going to dip my finger in here and then go over it. If it starts to get sticky, dip my finger back in a little bit more water. Like I say, this is acrylic. And any little blurbs or anything, you can just pretty much wipe off the edge. Any excess liquid can be rubbed into the foam. And voila! I'm going to let that dry, do the other side, and then come back in 24 hours and sand it down smooth. Which, like I say, you don't have to do. Nor is this a necessary part of the process. If you're a little more careful and a little more precise, these will all line up much better. And you won't have as much of a seam, but you're still going to have a seam. And you can use things like Mod Podge and kind of gunk it up in there, but I've never found that it works quite as well as this. Several other techniques you can use are things like Bondo or wood filler, but those I feel are much more caustic than this and require sanding. They're stiffer, sometimes they crack. This stuff is pretty flexible even when it's dried. Okay, so I've let this dry on both sides, and it came out pretty good. Next, I'm going to use some 600 grit sandpaper. I wouldn't use anything rougher than this. And whenever I sand this, I don't apply a lot of pressure. And there's some globbing and stuff here on the sides. Smooth that out and basically remove it. Get it nice and smooth so when you paint it, it'll be nice and consistent. This also helps to give you a squared edge. And for the top here, I just lightly sand until it feels nice and smooth. Like that. Now the next step is painting. There's several things you can do to speed up and ease this process. One is to spray it with plastidip. Normally I would do this, but I just used the last of it up, making a chest, shoulder, and back armor for my bat suit. So instead, another thing you can do that is less expensive and does have a somewhat faster drying time is use Mod Podge and brush a layer over that. Using a heat gun or a hair dryer and lightly going over this to seal up the foam will help too, because generally what happens is your paint just sinks into it for a while until you finally build up enough that it is going to actually look consistent and decent. What I've done is I've mixed some black acrylic craft paint in with some Mod Podge at about a 50-50 mixture, and I'm going to brush that over everything here except for this area here on the back where I'm going to attach my velcro, and this area here where velcro will also go on these two undersides. So I've finished with the painting process, and I've taken and put more coats on this bottom part than on the top so that there's a contrast. This is slightly more rough in appearance and matte. I left it that way for a reason. I'm going to use this, which is a couple scrap pieces of 5mm EVA foam that I glued together, and I glued some replacement window screen that is used for home repairs and glued that on there. And I'm going to dry brush this with some metallic and stamp it on there. Clean dry brush, put a little bit of metallic silver craft paint onto the brush. I'm going to dab some of this just here and there. Brush that out onto the screen itself before it dries. So off camera, I took and covered this with a piece of plastic shopping bag, and I sprayed some Valspar Project Perfect top coat. It is a flat matte finish, and I sprayed that just over the bottom part here. The top I left the same. And I always want to point out that it's very important when you do these things to wear a mask and gloves. For the finishing touch, I'm taking this once again, except this time I'm going to use some gloss Mod Podge. And I'm going to use that instead of the metallic paint that I had used earlier. It can be a little bit tricky getting the Mod Podge or the paint on the screen without getting it stuck to the foam underneath, which is why I left this a little bit loose. And this is to add a little extra definition to what I had done earlier. Okay, so I've let this dry. You can see different in the contrast in some of the areas that were stamped. How it looks when the light hits it. And the last thing I'm going to do is glue on the Velcro on the back. I measured this to the width of my belt and then added extra area for the surface to glue it to. And as I said earlier, I did not paint this part. And I left kind of a wide space, and I can always go back later and cover this with some sealer once I glue it on. So first I'm going to start by putting some hot glue on here where I want the bottom piece. And this is going to fold up with the fuzzy side out. So I'm going to glue it fuzzy side down. Press that on there and be careful not to get any of the glue on me because it is very hot. Anybody that's had skin contact with hot glue knows that it's no fun. Now, similarly on top, I put glue where I want it to be, centered up as best I can. And this, I'm going to glue the flat side down, because when it bends up, it's going to close on the other side. And on occasion I have had these come off. I've had the hot glue come loose. Contact cement works a little better. But when it does come off, I don't re-hot glue it. I take some super glue and dab some on each piece and then put them right back together, and that is much more permanent. You can also go around a bead of super glue once the hot glue cools. I wouldn't do it before it cools. That's not safe. So there you have it, folks. You just fold these over your belt and Velcro. And I want to put a little slideshow at the end here and show you some of the different variations, some photos of the different utility pouches that I did that are similar to this. And if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments.